When most people hear Mary cooked for Jesus, they picture his mother kneeling by a fire in Nazareth. And she did, when he was a boy. She ground the grain before dawn. She baked the bread. She was the one with flour under her nails and smoke in her hair before anyone else in the house was awake. But during those 3 years of ministry, when Jesus was walking from village to village, teaching, healing, sleeping in borrowed rooms, the woman who most often prepared the meal was not his mother. It was Martha. Martha of Bethany. Luke 10 makes it plain. Martha opened her home. Martha served. Martha prepared everything. Her sister Mary sat at Jesus' feet and listened. Martha cooked, and she deserves the credit. But here is a necessary honesty. We do not have Martha's recipe book. No one wrote down the exact dishes she set on the table. What we do have is something more useful: the complete archaeological and textual record of what people ate in first-century Palestine. What grew in Galilee, what was sold in the markets of Judea, what was stored in clay jars in the homes archaeologists have excavated across the region. We know the ingredients, we know the tools, we know the fuel, the spices, the storage methods, the dietary laws, the seasonal rhythms. And from all of this, we can reconstruct with real confidence the food that Jesus knew from childhood, the meals that were almost certainly placed before him, and the table that a capable hostess like Martha would have prepared for an honored guest. This is that food, not guesswork, but the documented daily reality of an entire civilization. Eaten with bare hands, scooped with torn bread, shared from a common bowl on the floor of a borrowed room. Everything started with bread, not sometimes, every single day. Bread was not a side dish in first-century Palestine, it was the meal. The Hebrew word for bread, lehem, literally meant food. If you said, "Let's eat bread," you meant, "Let's eat." Scholars estimate bread provided between 50 and 70% of a person's daily calories. The stew, the olives, the cheese, those were additions. Bread was the foundation, and making it was the first labor of every morning. Before dawn, while the sky was still gray, a woman would kneel on the packed earth floor and reach into a large clay storage jar filled with barley grain. Barley, not wheat. Wheat was finer, lighter, and expensive. Barley was coarser, denser, cheaper, the grain of the working class. She scooped it into a stone mortar, a heavy basalt bowl worn smooth from years of daily use, and began grinding. The pestle cracking hard kernels, twisting, pressing, crushing them into a rough flour. Not fine like modern flour, coarse, gritty between the fingers. 20 to 30 minutes of steady work before anything else could begin. Then the flour went into a wide clay bowl, a well pushed into the center, pieces of yesterday's dough torn in, the sourdough starter, the leaven. There was no packaged yeast. You saved a lump from the day before and let it ferment overnight. Then water from the village well, a pour of olive oil, thick, golden green. She kneaded with the heels of her palms, pressing forward, folding back, 5 to 10 minutes until the dough was smooth and elastic. Covered with cloth, left to rise for an hour. While the dough rested, she lit the taboon, a dome-shaped clay oven in the courtyard, lined inside with flat pebbles. The fuel was not wood. Wood was scarce. She used dried animal dung mixed with straw and twigs. It sounds rough, but dried dung burns slowly, evenly, and produces steady heat. Flint struck against stone. A spark caught on straw. The flame nursed with breath until it held. Then the oven sealed with a clay lid for 30 or 40 minutes until the stones inside were white hot. When the dough had doubled, she tore it into pieces, flattened each one into a rough circle, pressed dimples with her fingertips, and laid each round directly onto the scorching pebbles. The dough sizzled on contact, 2 or 3 minutes per side. The bottom took the shape of the stones, bumpy, cratered, golden brown. She pulled each flatbread out with practiced fingers and stacked them under a cloth. That bread was the day's currency. It would be torn and dipped at dawn. It would be wrapped in cloth and carried on the road. It would be folded into a scoop at the evening meal and used as the only utensil most families possessed. There were no forks, no spoons, no plates. The bread did everything. The first meal came just after dawn, and it was fast, functional, and almost invisible. There was no sitting down. You ate so you could work. A piece of fresh bread torn and dipped in olive oil. A few olives, dark, wrinkled, cured in salt brine. A handful of dried figs or dates. Maybe parched grain, roasted barley kernels, crunchy, nutty, carried in a pouch. Sometimes soft cheese, goat's milk curdled and pressed into cloth, tangy and cool, similar to labneh. Sometimes nothing more than leftover bread from the night before, hardened overnight but softened by a dip in oil or vinegar wine. You ate quickly. You got moving. A fisherman had to reach the boat. A carpenter had to reach the workbench. A woman had water to carry, grain to grind, animals to feed. The morning meal was not a ceremony. It was fuel. For Jesus and his disciples, men who walked from village to village for 3 years, the road was the table, and the road was unpredictable. What you ate depended entirely on what you carried and who was willing to share. Bread from the morning, wrapped in cloth and tucked into the fold of a belt, was the only guaranteed provision. Beyond that, dried figs, a handful of almonds, dates that wouldn't spoil in the heat. You might dip the bread in posca, a cheap sour vinegar wine mixture that was part refreshment, part condiment. Ruth did exactly this in the book that bears her name. Bread dipped in vinegar at the edge of a harvest field. Luke 6 tells us the disciples plucked raw grain from the edges of fields as they walked, rubbing the heads between their palms and eating the kernels. Deuteronomy allowed this. Travelers could eat from the edges, they just couldn't harvest. But the deeper reality was dependence. Jesus sent his disciples out with instructions to carry no bread, no bag, no money. They were to eat whatever was set before them in whatever house received them. If a village did not welcome them, they moved on. The hospitality of strangers was not a bonus. It was the only food source. And when no one opened the door, they went hungry. This was not a hypothetical scenario. It was a structural feature of itinerant life. The feeding of the 5,000 is miraculous not only because of what happened, but because of what preceded it. The crowd had followed Jesus into a remote place with no provisions, no market, no host. 5 loaves and 2 fish. That was everything available for thousands of people. Hunger in transit was not an exception. It was the permanent companion of a life lived without storage, without a kitchen, without certainty that the next meal would come. When Jesus later said, "I was hungry and you gave me food. I was a stranger and you welcomed me," he was not inventing a scenario. He was describing his own experience. When the day ended and the family gathered, or when a traveling teacher arrived and the household assembled around the fire, the evening meal was built around a single clay pot. One pot, one fire, one dish for everyone. The logic was simple and absolute. Fuel was expensive, cookware was limited, and nothing edible could be wasted. A woman heated olive oil in a round-bottomed clay vessel, set over a low flame of dried dung and straw. the same fuel as the bread oven, the same acrid smoke that never fully left the house. In went chopped onions, pungent, yellow, cheap, available everywhere. Then crushed garlic, 3 or 4 cloves smashed flat with a stone. The smell filled the entire house and bled through the thin walls to the neighbors. Then, whatever legume the family had, red lentils, chickpeas, fava beans. The lentils broke down into a thick, golden porridge. The chickpeas held their shape and gave more substance. Some nights it was beans alone with a fistful of wild greens, mallow, chicory, mustard leaf, pulled from the hillside that afternoon and thrown in to stretch the pot further. Cumin seeds, crushed in a mortar, warm, earthy, nutty. Ground coriander, maybe dill. Jesus himself named these spices in Matthew 23 when he criticized the Pharisees for tithing their mint, dill, and cumin while neglecting justice. He knew these flavors. They were on his table. A pinch of coarse salt from the Dead Sea, grayish, gritty, stirred in at the end. The stew simmered for 30 or 40 minutes, thickening, darkening, and everyone ate from the same bowl. You tore a piece of flatbread, folded it into a scoop, dipped into the common dish. The intimacy of the shared bowl was not accidental. It was the entire architecture of the meal. When Jesus said at the Last Supper, "The one who dips his hand in the bowl with me will betray me," the shock was not the bowl, it was the betrayal. The hand that shared your food was the hand that would deliver you to death. But food did not last, and keeping it from spoiling was one of the most critical tasks a household faced. Grain, the most essential reserve, was stored in large clay jars sealed with stoppers, raised off the floor on stone platforms to guard against moisture and rodents. A family's entire supply for the dry months might fit in 3 or 4 vessels. If one cracked, if a rat gnawed through the seal, if moisture seeped in and the grain sprouted or blackened with mold, that was famine at the family level. No replacement was coming until the next harvest. Fish was gutted, rubbed with coarse salt and laid flat under the sun until it was stiff and dry. Dried fish could last for months and was traded across the entire region, arriving inland in bundles that smelled of salt and shore. Olives were packed in brine in sealed jars. Grapes were dried into raisins or pressed into thick syrup. Figs and dates were compressed into dense cakes, chewy, dark, intensely sweet, that could be stored for a year. Every sealed jar was an act of faith that the clay would hold and the food inside would survive. And the fear of a ruined supply, the slow horror of opening a jar and finding worms, rot, or spoiled grain, was a real anxiety that shaped how families thought about every season, every purchase, every meal they chose not to eat today, so that something would remain for tomorrow. When a guest arrived, an honored teacher, a respected elder, a relative from another town, the table changed. Not because the family suddenly became wealthy, but because hospitality demanded it. To welcome someone into your home and set a poor table was a disgrace that could follow the family for years. So the woman worked harder. More bread was baked, perhaps from the better flour if there was any. The finest olive oil was brought out, first pressing, lighter, sweeter, saved in a smaller jar for exactly this purpose. Olives were arranged more generously. Cheese was set alongside herbs. If the family had preserved fish, it appeared. If there was dried meat, rare but possible, it was added to the stew. The pot was fuller, the spices more generous, the portions larger. A guest ate first and best. The host family ate what remained. This is the world behind Martha. When Jesus arrived at her home in Bethany, She was not just cooking, she was performing the most important social obligation her culture demanded. The meal she set before him was her family's honor made visible. Her anxiety, what Luke describes as being distracted by all the preparations, was not neurosis. It was the pressure of a woman who understood that every dish, every pour of oil, every piece of bread communicated whether her household was worthy of the guest sitting in her living room. But not everyone ate like this. In the wealthier homes of Jerusalem, in the households of merchants and priests and Herodian officials, the table looked radically different. Wheat bread instead of barley, finer, lighter, a visible marker of status. Meat appeared more often, lamb, goat, sometimes veal, purchased from temple-adjacent butchers who handled the slaughter according to the law. Fresh fish arrived from the coast or the Sea of Galilee, packed in salt and rushes, still firm enough to grill. The oil was always first pressing. The wine was better, less diluted, sometimes imported. Spices that a village kitchen would never see appeared in these households. Saffron, cinnamon, black pepper brought along trade routes from India and Arabia at staggering cost. Servants prepared the food. Finer pottery held the dishes. The dining room was furnished with couches for reclining in the Roman style. Guests were anointed with perfumed oil upon arrival. The contrast between this table and the barley bread and lentil table of a Galilean fisherman was the distance between two worlds sharing the same land. When Jesus ate with Pharisees, and the Gospels record that he did, multiple times, he entered this world. When he ate with tax collectors and sinners, he sat at a table somewhere in between. And when he broke bread with his disciples on the road, he ate like the poor. He moved between all these tables. He belonged to none of them exclusively. And that fluidity itself was a statement that his contemporaries noticed, criticized, and could not ignore. Wine was the daily drink, not water. Clean water was unreliable and could carry illness. Wine mixed with water, usually 2 or 3 parts water to 1 part wine, was safer and universal. The natural acidity helped neutralize what the water carried. It was practical, not indulgent. Wine was stored in clay jars or leather wineskins, and the wineskins mattered. Jesus' parable about new wine in old wineskins was not abstract imagery. Old leather loses elasticity. New wine, still fermenting, produces gas. Put expanding wine into a brittle skin, and the skin bursts, and both wine and container are lost. Every person in his audience had seen this happen. The parable worked because it described a real kitchen disaster. But wine was not equally available. The Mishnah notes that when prescribing provisions for a separated wife, wine was excluded, because the wives of the poor do not drink wine. For the poorest families, the drink was water, or posca, a cheap, sour vinegar wine mixture used across the Roman world. The same drink a soldier offered to Jesus on the cross. Honey was the only sweetener anyone knew. No sugar existed. Honey was drizzled over bread, stirred into warm drinks, mixed into date cakes. Wild honey was collected from rock crevices and hollow trees. John the Baptist survived on it in the wilderness alongside his locusts. Date syrup, dibs, served a similar function, thicker and darker, boiled down from the fruit until it was dense enough to pour in a slow stream. Many scholars believe this is what the Torah actually means by honey in the phrase, "a land flowing with milk and honey." Not bee honey, but the thick syrup of the date palm. Sweetness in any form was precious. It marked a meal as special. It turned ordinary bread into something that tasted like celebration. And then there was the meal that transformed everything. The Passover, the most sacred night in the Jewish calendar. The preparation began days before. Every crumb of leaven, every piece of fermented dough, every leftover scrap of risen bread had to be removed from the house. Women searched with a lamp, sweeping corners, scraping the kneading bowl, checking storage jars. The absence of leaven was a commandment, not a custom. By the time the Seder began, the house had been scoured to bare surfaces. The lamb was purchased days in advance and inspected for any blemish, a year-old male without defect. On the afternoon of the 14th of Nisan, it was taken to the temple and slaughtered by the priests. Its blood poured at the base of the altar. The lamb was carried home still warm and roasted whole over open fire, not boiled, not stewed, roasted, as Exodus specified. On the evening of Passover, the smell of roasting lamb filled every street in Jerusalem. Hundreds of thousands of lambs simultaneously over hundreds of thousands of fires. Josephus wrote that the smoke was visible for miles. On the table, unleavened bread, flat, brittle, baked without yeast, because the Israelites had no time for the dough to rise when they fled Egypt. Bitter herbs, raw horseradish or endive, sharp enough to bring tears, to remember the bitterness of slavery. Charoset, a thick paste of chopped fruit, nuts. Wine and cinnamon, its color representing the mortar the slaves used in Pharaoh's construction sites. Salt water for the tears of the oppressed. 4 cups of wine, each with specific meaning and precise timing. The youngest child asked 4 questions. The father answered with the story. The entire family relived the Exodus, not through a book, but through taste. Bitterness, sweetness, salt, wine, fire. Every flavor was theology. And it was during this meal, this ancient, prescribed, theologically charged meal, that Jesus reached for the most common, most ordinary food in the ancient world. He took bread, he broke it, and he said, "This is my body, given for you." He took the cup of wine and said, "This is my blood of the covenant, poured out for many." Bread and wine, the daily food of the poor, ingredients that had been on every table in every village every night for 1,000 years. And in a single sentence, he made them eternal. The bread that Martha ground and kneaded and baked before dawn. The wine that was mixed and poured at every evening table. He took what was ordinary and turned it into the center of a faith that would outlast every empire in the room. That is the food Jesus knew. Bread ground by hand and baked on hot stones in the dark before sunrise. A one-pot stew of lentils and onions simmered over dung fire until the clay was too hot to touch. Olives and cheese and figs laid out on a mat. Dried fish pulled from a sealed jar smelling of salt and months. Wine cut with water in a common cup. Everything scooped with torn bread, eaten with bare hands, shared from a single bowl. And the woman behind most of those meals, the one grinding, kneading, lighting the fire, stirring the pot, pouring the oil, cleaning the dishes alone in the dark, was Martha, the one Jesus gently told to slow down, not because her labor didn't matter, but because he was sitting right there in her house, and that moment, his presence at her table, eating the bread she had baked, would not come again. Martha cooked. Mary listened. And Jesus, the carpenter's son who grew up on barley bread and lentil stew, ate what was given with gratitude, sat at every kind of table, and turned the simplest meal in the world into something that outlasted the stones of the temple itself. What surprised you most? The bread, the one-pot stew, the guest table, or the Passover? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one.